Hi guys, welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk about the Jungian Cognitive Function stack. So we're going to look at the stack and discuss what are its parts, what each slot represents, what is it called, most common naming conventions, as well as we're going to look at some additional terminology that we're going to use later on in this series. So let's start with the stack now. The first thing that we need to notice about this is that it is ordered. We already talked about this in previous videos, but what this means is that the functions that you have in the stack, the four functions, each personality type has four functions. Here in the example, we have the INTJ, but each function is represented in your type with different strength, and the strength of the type is ordered in an ascending way, where the last function, the fourth one, has the weakest strength, and the first function is the strongest one. The two middle ones, you can say they're kind of balanced, so usually their strength is around the same, but the second one most of the time is more important for you to develop, since it actually is balancing your first one, since it is in opposite direction, right? The first one, if it was introverted, then the second one is going to be extroverted. Okay, so now we can look at each slot and see what is the terminology around it, so how is it called, and some short explanation of what is the purpose of this slot and how it affects your personality. So we can start with the first SWOT. On the first SWOT, we have this first function, which we usually, what we call it is, we can use the terms dominant or lead or hero. These are the most common terms, I think, that we use for this function. And I really like the mythological representation of the hero, because with one word, it encapsulates what the first function does. You can think about the first function as the process that you're going to be most comfortable in, but if you don't have any external pressures or external things that try to influence you, so in your most natural state, you're going to be using this first function as your leading process. This is what you're going to be extremely good at, and what people call talent, usually it's going to be associated with this first SWOT within your cognitive function stack. So this is the first function, we call it dominant, lead, or hero. So for the second one, we usually use the terminology secondary, or I think most common is auxiliary, or parent. If we continue with these mythological references, so the first function is the hero, the second one is the parent, and if we want to explain it again in this mythological sense, so for the parent function, the one important thing is that it is in opposite direction to the first one. So if the first one was introverted, the second one is extroverted, which means that it is balancing your first and most natural process. And this also makes it very important in your development, because if you're usually, if the first function, the dominant one, as we said, is your most natural process, in order for you to utilize the process and to integrate it within the environment you are in, you probably need your second function to help you out, since otherwise you become too one-sided. So this is the auxiliary parent function. Some differences are that your hero process, your leading process, can be, you can think about it as a bit more reckless. So it's trying to go and lead the things. You're really good at these things, but at some point it's not very responsible. It just wants to go to the end, like to the bottom of its own process. But for the parent process, usually it is very responsible. So you can assign responsibility for it. This is why it's called a parent. So if you're an introvert, then your second process is extroverted, and it allows you to integrate your introverted side into the world. And for the extrovert, it is the opposite. So for the extrovert, their first leading process is going to be extroverted, and the second one is going to be introverted, which allows them to actually come back to themselves and figure out subjectively some of the things that they're having trouble with, instead of just jumping into the environment around them all the time with their extroverted process, leading extroverted process. Okay, so this is for the parent SWOT. For the third SWOT, for the child SWOT, we have, so this is the naming, it's tertiary or child. And usually this SWOT is quite a bit less developed than the first SWOT, than the leading one. And people who use a specific function in the third SWOT, they tend to overvalue the strength of this function. So they think they're actually better at this than they actually are. But still they're pretty good at it. So if you consider all the types, you know that whatever is in your third SWOT you're going to share it with one other type. So only two types have the same function as you in the third SWOT, and also 4 more types are going to be stronger than you. So in this example, for the INTJ, it has FI third. So there are only 4 other types which have FI at second and first, so stronger FI. So even though you might be overestimating the strength of this function, usually it's actually quite good. Only 4 other types have better than you. And the purpose of this function, some people say that it's your playful function, so you like to relax in it. And another important thing here is that it has the same orientation as your first function. So usually when you're in your dominant or lead function, so you're using it, you're probably using it in a combination with your third function, because this is naturally how your consciousness works. And in order to snap out of it, you have to engage into the second or the fourth function in order to get into the opposite orientation of what you're doing right now. So this thing of going into first plus third function is actually called looping. So we'll talk about it a bit more on this fourth point here. Okay, and for the last one, for the last function, the last SWOT, we usually call it inferior or also aspirational. It's another way to call it. So you say this is quite opposite terminology. Why do we use this kind of terminology? Well, the inferior is because it is the weakest one, and usually the purpose of it in your life is that you're going to have a lot of trouble with this on regular basis, and you're going to have to figure out how to avoid this function being your bottleneck. But still, it's good to understand your personality in a way that, you know, okay, this is my weakness, so what can I do? How can I integrate myself in a way that my weakness, my inferior function is not troubling me so much. It's not becoming a bottleneck for me. So this is what it's called inferior, but at the same time, the other way it's called is aspirational. And the idea here is that if you lean onto it in specific moments, it can become very pivotal for you. So you can think about it as like this is your the last thing you need to integrate in order to make things happen. Maybe usually people who develop their personality, they develop it in an ordered way. As we know, the personality is sorted, as we talked before. So this is your weakest function. The first one is the strongest, and when usually when people develop, they develop from strongest to weakest functions. So they're going to be really strong in the first one, and the second and third one is probably going to be pretty good as well. But the fourth one is going to be not so great. And what happens sometimes is that the fourth one is actually your missing piece of the puzzle, and once you are able to integrate it, you're able to become this more complete version of your type, and you're able to achieve more things because you have developed your weakness in a good enough way to not become your bottleneck. Okay, this is about the function SWOTs and some general description about what they do, how they're called. Now we can go into the terminology. So we see here a couple of terms that we want to discuss, and we'll go through them. So first one is when you say NI lead, DOM, or whatever function is here, so it can be TE, FI lead, or DOM. So when we say this later on in the series, we will mean that this is referring to a type who has this function at their first SWOT, as we know, as we understood here now from the terminology. So for example, an INTJ is an NI lead. Same for the INFJ, who is also an NI lead. When we say NI user, though, it will mean that they use this function within their 4 functions. So it is within their Jungian stack. So in this specific example, the INTJ is going to be an NI user since it uses NI, but they're also going to be a TE user, an FI user, SE user as well. So if you have the function, you're a user of that function. This is the terminology that we're going to use. Another thing we want to use is this active versus passive function. So in the case of the INTJ, so active versus passive is going to mean that active is if your function is in the top 2 SWOTs. So for the INTJ, the active functions are NI and TE. So these are active, and those here are passive. So if we say a person uses passive FI, it can be an INTJ, right? Because it has 3rd SWOT FI, or it can be an INTJ, which has 4th SWOT FI. And if it is an active user of the function, it means that the function is within the first 2 SWOTs. Okay, this regarding point number 3. So point number 4 is about functional attitude. So this is another concept where since the first and the third SWOT function are in the same orientation, we already discussed a bit about this, you can say that they have this positive attitude. So I'll add a plus here for it. So what positive attitude means is that you're comfortable in those functions, since you're most comfortable in your first process, but since it is introverted and your third is also introverted, you become very comfortable in both of those processes at the same time, since they can be used together. And then at the second and fourth thought, you can say that you have a negative attitude, since it is uncomfortable for you to go in this other direction. So if you're an introvert, it is uncomfortable to go to the extroverted direction, and vice versa for the extroverts. And this is what we call functional attitudes. And the importance of this is actually in this whooping thing, which is if you go into your first and third function, you can be completely lost in doing this loop between first and third function without actually consulting your second or fourth functions. And this can create a lot of troubles with you. And usually people who are depressed or who are like walking some direction or are wondering what they need to do, they have to lean on their second process, which, although it has a negative attitude, is going to help them out to get outside of this first, third function loop. Okay, so this is the whooping. And the last concept is about what are temperaments. So if you look at the 16 personality side, they have defined temperaments in a specific way. They have grouped the types in a specific way, but we're going to group the types in a different way, which makes more sense in my opinion. And how we're going to group the types is based on their top two slots. So whichever functions you have at the top two slots, this is going to define your temperament. So for example, for the INTJ, it is part of the NT temperament because the first two functions are intuition and thinking, so N and T. And for me, this makes more sense because usually if those are the strongest two functions, which is what we're talking about so far, this means that they're going to have the most influence over your personality. And it makes sense that the temperament that you're going to create is based on that. Okay guys, this is going to be enough for this video, and thanks for watching, and see you next time.